Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video on plasticity, we're going to do something slightly different. Even though we've got beginner content on getting started with plasticity through all the different versions that have been released, what we're talking about today is more about understanding the theory of workflow or how to use plasticity in a general sense. So even with all of the beginner content and getting started content we have, I still do get questions about how do you actually use plasticity? It's really hard to understand. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about plasticity in general. We're going to look at some shortcuts I feel like you should commit to memory if you plan on using plasticity, and then talk about a couple of the basic or general workflows so we can understand how the program works. We're not going to be doing a full UI overview or walking you through how to rotate the model. We've got content for that. We've done some deep dives into things like setting up a laptop for plasticity, getting started with solid and surface modeling, 3D printing, all kinds of different stuff. So if you want any of that content, I'll try to leave some links in the description of this video for you. But this video is going to be for the beginner who is struggling to understand the basics of plasticity, how to get started and how to work with the program. So if that sounds like you, stick around and hopefully this video will help. So first things first, plasticity is a direct modeling program. There's no history, there's no saved information about sketches or features that get added like a traditional CAD program. So if you're coming from a CAD program or if you're coming from a program like Blender, where you're used to having things like a modifier stack where you can reorder things and change things, we don't really have that in plasticity. I would assume that those coming in and struggling a bit have little to no CAD experience, but it's also possible that you just are very familiar with other programs. Unlike most other programs, there is no toolbar or ribbon across the top. So if you're coming from any traditional CAD program, any sort of mainstream program in the last 10 years, they've all sort of had this ribbon interface across the top. Plasticity is very much a minimal interface, but everything is still there. You just have to know how to find it. The second thing is that plasticity very much rewards you for shortcut use. There are ways in which we can get access to all these tools. You don't actually have to use any shortcuts at all, but there are a handful of shortcuts we'll talk about in this video that really make a big difference on just average modeling. So with all that said, let's first talk about the shortcuts I think that you should commit to memory. At this point, you should already have plasticity downloaded, installed, and you hopefully have gone through some of the other beginner content that we have or somebody, another channel, and you are at least familiar with things like rotating the model around with the middle mouse wheel, panning it with the right mouse wheel, and zooming in with a scroll wheel. Now, if you have that stuff down, that's really all you need to know for this video so far. The first shortcut key that I want to focus on is G on the keyboard, which is move. Now, this may seem counterintuitive if you're coming from another program like, let's say, Fusion, where move is M on the keyboard, or maybe you've never even used a shortcut key for this. G is the shortcut key for move in Blender, and I think that it kind of stands for grab. You're grabbing the object and moving it around. What we need to do is select the object, and then we can either click on move down here if you want, or again, the shortcut key is going to be extremely helpful for you is G on the keyboard. Once you hit any tool or invoke any command in plasticity, the bottom right, you're going to see information about additional keys that you can hit to work with whatever tool you have active. So in this case, for things like move and also rotate and scale that we'll talk about, there'll be plenty of shortcut keys that we can do, like hitting the same command or the same shortcut like G will lock us to the cursor, which is allowing us to move in screen space. If we hit X, it's going to lock the move only in the X direction. Y only in the Y direction, Z only in the Z direction. The next ones that say Shift Z, Shift X, and Shift Y, those are going to lock or restrict motion in that direction. So for example, Shift and Z will keep us from moving in the Z direction and allow us to move in the XY plane. Shift and X will keep us moving in the YZ plane, and Shift and Y will keep us moving in the XZ plane. There are also some other options like freestyle and pivot, which we've talked about in other videos, but in this video, we're not really going to dive deep into that. So at this point, make sure that you get comfortable with using G on the keyboard to move. And the reason this is important is because it works with things like complex curves. So if we've got complex curves and we want to, let's say, move this vertex around, that's how we're going to adjust a curve in space. If we want to move a face around, or we want to move some other geometry around, or multiple bodies around, the move command is going to be very versatile and allow us to do things like move those curves, move the control points, move the entire objects around. The next one that we want is to select our object and look at rotate. Now again, this is R on the keyboard, which if you've used any other program like Blender, it'll be the same there. Some programs you may find rotate nested underneath the move command. So in Fusion, for example, move allows us to move and rotate. In Plasticity, in Blender, and other programs, they'll be independent. Once again, if you hit the R key or the same shortcut key again, what we're going to do is rotate in screen space, which is also this white circle here. So basically whatever view that you have of your object, that's going to be the direction it rotates. X will let you rotate about X, Y will let you rotate about Y, and Z lets you rotate about Z. I'm going to hit escape on that one. And then S for scale, which is down here as well. This allows us to hit S again and scale uniformly based on our cursor. We can scale in just the X direction, just the Y direction, or just the Z direction as well. Once again, there are other options like Shift Z if we only want to scale on the XY plane. So you can see it's keeping the height the same, but it's making the length and width different. Or if you want to use things like Shift X and Shift Y. I'm going to hit escape on that. So the reason that these are all important is because they will greatly impact the speed at which you model. Basically, any of these commands that you see down here, move, rotate, scale, duplicate object, which is Shift D, and Boolean, these 5 right here are ones that you will use all the time. So for example, let's just do a quick test of this. You don't have to follow along, but just so you can understand how it works. What I'm going to do is hit Shift D to duplicate that object and right click. Then I'm going to hit S and S again, which is going to scale down. Now by default, X-ray is on, which means that we're seeing the wireframe or the lines inside. I'm going to right click to accept, S, and I'm going to scale this out in X, which again I could do by hitting X on the keyboard and locking it in, and right click to accept. Now I'm going to select the first object, Q for Boolean, select this one, and then right click to accept. Now you can see there, pretty quick for us to do that. Once you understand the basics of moving, rotating, scaling, duplicating, as well as Boolean, which again, these are Shift and D and Q on the keyboard. Once you understand these 5 right here, those are going to be very common tools that you use over and over again. So it's really important to try and commit those to memory, more so the move, rotate, and scale, but Shift D for duplicate and also Boolean. Now, in many cases in Plasticity, there may be shortcut keys that will do multiple things, or there'll be multiple keys that do the same thing. Now, what I mean by that is a lot of times there'll be commands like join, which can join sheets or surfaces together. It can also join curves together. So there'll be one tool that can do multiple things. And in other cases, commands like selecting a face and hitting delete on the keyboard or hitting X on the keyboard, sometimes those things will actually allow us to do the same thing. Now, in other cases, you may actually need to use a combination like Shift and X if you're trying to delete a face from a solid body, whereas if you have a set of surfaces or sheets, you can just hit X to delete it without having to worry about it trying to patch it. So there are some benefits to some of these commands, and they work in different ways, but the overall, or the arching theme here is that shortcuts are highly rewarded in Plasticity. There are a handful that you really should know. And as you get more comfortable, you start to remember things like join is J, X is delete, Shift and A is for align, Shift and R is to repeat the last command. And you'll just get more and more comfortable with these commands that you use over and over again. Next, there are a couple of other shortcuts that I think are important to get comfortable with. And again, none of these are strictly required because you can always click on things. But what I try to do whenever I'm modeling is minimize the movement of the cursor. So having to go all the way to the top left to select control point or edge, and then back here to make my selection and then round everything off, for example. That can take a bit of time, and if you're doing it constantly, it can waste a lot of time when you're trying to model something. So the next thing that we want to do is understand that the numbers across the top of your keyboard, 1 through 5, will dictate the shortcuts for your selection filter. So for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 will select all. Now there is a bonus here. If you hit tab when nothing else is selected or no dialogues are active, that will also select everything. But if you just remember 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, that'll be a good way to do it. You can also hold down the Shift key and then manually add or remove additionals from that selection. So if you don't want everything to be able to be selected, for example, if you don't want bodies, but you want the control vertices, the edges, and the faces, or let's say you just want edges and faces, you can hold down the Shift key and use those numbers to do that as well. So that can be very helpful. On the number pad on your keyboard, if you've got a full-size keyboard or if you have a laptop that has a full-size keyboard, then 1 is going to be your front view, Control and 1 will be your back view, 3 will be right, Control and 3 will be left, and 7 will be top, and Control and 7 will be bottom. There's also another shortcut key in here, the number 5, which is going to be perspective and ortho, which is this button up here. So if you have a model that's rotated around, let's go ahead and just pull it down here, and you go back and forth between perspective and an orthographic view, you can see that it adds that distortion. There is also some settings in here for field of view and squish for the perspective. But again, don't worry too much about these, but that's the number 5 on the keyboard. I tend to like to model in perspective because when I go to a normal view like this, it automatically goes to an orthographic view if I'm on a construction plane. So once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 across the top of your keyboard, and 1, 3, and 7, as well as Control 1, 3, and 7 on the numpads. All those are going to be very important, and make sure that you remember them. So with those out of the way, I do want to add a couple of honorable mentions. One of the honorable mentions is the space bar for creating a temporary construction plane. As we get to talk about the general workflows, you're likely going to be creating a lot of curves, and sometimes you can do those on the default planes, the default XY, YZ, and XZ, but sometimes they need to be on a specific face in the design. So for example, if I need to create a sketch or curves on this chamfer here, I can hit the space bar and that'll create a temporary construction plane that is going to be based on that face. Then I can grab a circle, I can place it at the center, I can get off my temporary construction plane, and now I can pull this down through the body. I can come down here and say difference, which is W on the keyboard, select the original object, and then I can hide or delete that circle. So now I was able to create a cut through that based on my temporary construction plane that was based off that chamfer. Another shortcut key or set of shortcut keys that's really important is going to be the / and the period. Now, when we're talking about things like /, this is going to zoom everything that's everything that's visible in the model to view. And then the selected object, if we hit it again, it'll zoom that selected object to view. If we hit the period key, what it's going to do is it's going to isolate the selected object. What this means is it's going to hide everything else that's not selected. If you don't do anything else, if you still leave that original object selected and hit the period again, it'll bring it back. But that can be pretty helpful to be able to quickly isolate those objects. All right, so now that we've got a couple of those shortcut keys out of the way, the last 2 shortcuts I really think are important to understand are going to be the F key and Shift and F. Let's go ahead and hide that, Shift and F. All right, so both of these can be clicked on. F is right here, and Shift and F is right here. Now, they do 2 very different things, but there is some overlap between them. First, the F key, and the reason I think it's important to know that rather than to come down here to click it, is because it'll show up wherever your cursor is. This is a quick way for us to search for commands. So for example, raise degree. It'll tell you what the shortcut key is, and if you want to add it to your favorites, you can click Add to Favorites. Now the favorites are going to display directly under the search bar here. So you can see I've got toggle points, rebuild, raise degree, and constrained surface. So these four, maybe I use them all the time and I don't remember the shortcuts, or maybe they don't have shortcuts assigned, then I can simply add them to my favorites. Any of the commands that we want to add, we can click on these three dots and assign to favorites. Some of these commands have documentation that'll take you directly to the Plasticity website, and it'll give you more information on the commands. Note that not all of them have that yet. So for example, align doesn't have that, but most of the commands, at least in this version 2025, have started to populate that documentation. So this can be very handy. It's a quick way for us to search for commands if we know the name or roughly what the name is, but we don't know the shortcut, or maybe it doesn't have one. And remember, adding them to your favorites can be a very quick way, because this is going to pop up wherever your cursor is just by hitting F on the keyboard. The other dialog, Shift and F, this is going to be a contextual list of commands. And what I mean by that is it's going to be based on our current selection. So for example, if I select this body and hit Shift F, you'll notice that unjoin, which will turn this all into different sheets or surfaces. I've got a hollow option. I've got raise degree. If I duplicate this with Shift and D, and let's just say move this up and over, and I select both of these objects and I hit Shift F, then I'll get project and imprint as new options. If I maybe create a curve here, and I have the curve selected, you'll notice I get some different options here like pipe, loft, and sweep. And this allows me to make new geometry quickly and easily just based on that. So what I'm going to do is select this, hit Q, remove that, and then maybe join these two together, hit Q twice, get rid of that line. And you can see very quickly and easily we've started to make some geometry. Now this is kind of messy, but hopefully you get the idea that using both F to find commands or Shift and F to get contextual tools based on our current selection can be a really good way to speed up the process. Once again, these are located at the bottom center. You can always go and click on them there, but being able to have them pop up next to the cursor, to me, makes a lot more sense. At least the F key. Shift and F, the contextual tools, I don't use this one very much, honestly. Most of the commands that I use from here, I know the shortcut key for, and if I don't, I can always just hit F and search for them. So for example, let's say I forgot loft was L, then I can go ahead and just search for it there. All right, so that's all of the shortcut keys that I'm going to bore you with today, but these are all very important and will certainly help you in the modeling process. Now that we've got that sorted out, let's talk a little bit about the process or the general workflows inside of Plasticity. Now, in my mind, there are three basic workflows that we're going to talk about. We're excluding doing anything with mesh bodies, and we're excluding things like putting images or reference bodies or parts and snapping to them inside of Plasticity. So we're just talking about starting a new design. The first workflow or general premise of how to create geometry is what I call an additive workflow. Now, in an additive workflow, what we're going to do is we're going to either create geometry through curves or through primitives. So for example, hold down the left mouse button, I'll do a center rectangle at the origin, and then select it and pull it up into 3D. Now I'm going to simply hide the sketch. I could get rid of it or the curves, but the next thing that I would do is I would add to that. Now, adding to geometry, there's a couple ways that we can do it. We can create more primitive shapes or more curves. We can also work or manipulate the geometry directly. So for example, if I select this face, I am going to use offset, so Shift and F. And as I look down this list, I've got offset curve, O, on the keyboard. And what this is going to allow me to do is it's going to allow me to offset this face. Now, this is where I find it much easier for us to do this with shortcut keys, because I find that going through that menu for things like offset to be a bit just cumbersome. Whereas I'm going to hit escape and just show you. If I select this face and hit O, I can just pull that in relatively quickly. Now, another thing to note is that with our selection filters on, when all of them are on, I have to select the body first and then the face or the edge. That'll be 2 clicks. But if we have just face selection on, I can select the face, hit O, drag this in, and it's all relatively quick. Then I can pull this up and start to add new geometry to the design. We can also do things like rotate faces. So again, very quick for us to modify or manipulate the design. But the general premise here is that we are adding geometry. We're creating and we're adding something new. So again, O to offset and pull this out, and I'm adding geometry to the design. So that's one basic workflow, is this additive workflow, whether it's curve-based or primitive-based or using modification tools like offset face, you're adding geometry to the original object. The second workflow that I consider is a subtractive workflow. So using the same set of tools, I'm going to offset this face, for example, and then I'm going to pull this all the way through the other way. So what I did was I removed material. I took away material from the design, and this is what I consider a subtractive workflow. Now, in nearly every design that you make, if you're working with solids primarily, you're going to be using a combination of these. You're going to be using the creating geometry and adding to it. You're also going to be using the subtractive workflow and removing stuff from it. And there are modification tools. So for example, if I grab this inside edge and pull it, a fillet on the inside is adding material to the design. However, a fillet on the outside is removing material from the design. So we're taking material away from an external corner, but we're adding it on an internal corner. And this is true for a chamfer. So on the inside, we're adding material. On the outside, we'd be removing material. But again, the same tool, the same general workflow, and that's adding or removing material from your design. There are other tools that we can use. So for example, if I want to make a cut on this, let's do it on the back. If I want to make a cut on this back face, I've got tools like imprint, or I've got isoparam. So I'm going to hit F on the keyboard and I'm going to say isoparam. And then what I can do here is hit tab and I can divide this face up. So this allows me to create a division here, and I can either pull this geometry out and offset it if I want. We can also use these edges for tools like the pipe tool. Pipe tool is P on the keyboard. You can also find it in other places. That allows us to create like a recess cut in there. And of course, we could extend it out with these commands, but we're not really getting into a true modeling practice here. But the general point, the general idea here is that what we're doing is we're using basic tools, whether they're curves, whether they're primitives, whether they're some of these modification tools like offset, isoparam, pipe tool, to either add or remove geometry from the design. With that in mind, considering this is a direct modeling program, remember that we do not have history. We do have the ability to undo, so Control Z, for example. That allows us to undo back to a certain point in time. There will be a limit to that, but it is actually pretty far. But we don't have a history where we're really keeping sort of a clear record of what's happened for us to go back. Now, in some of our other videos, we have talked about tools like measure to be able to change the location and size of features. So there are some ways that we can do that. It is going to be limited, and it's not going to be a true parametric CAD program, but there is a possibility to do that. Okay, so with that said, those two general workflows for additive and subtractive, there is a third one, which is using surfaces or sheets. Next, let's go ahead and make a surface. Now, there are a couple of ways that we can make a surface. We can take a body, a solid body, and convert it to a surface, or we can build a surface ourselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a complex spline, just kind of give it some wiggles. And then I'm going to duplicate it. So Shift and D. I'm going to move it in the Y direction, move it in the X. Then I'm going to rotate it about Z. And I'm going to duplicate it again, Shift and D. We're going to move it in the X. And then we're going to rotate it about Z. And then I'm going to select each of these curves and we're going to loft it. So loft is L on the keyboard, but again, Shift and F, you can select it here. Right click to accept. And then we're going to hide all the guide curves. So H on the keyboard, or you can select the eyeball icon. So now we've got this sort of complex surface. Now with a surface, there are a couple things that we can do. We can use the surface as a cutting tool for a solid. We can use the surface and thicken it to create a solid. Or we can build out the rest of the shape. And with the rest of the shape, once we fill it in and make it watertight, then we'll be able to convert it to a solid body. So I'm going to change my selection to edges. I'm going to select these and hit L to loft. I'm going to use G2 continuity. Don't worry too much about what that means right now. But basically what we're doing is we're lofting from one side to the other. And then now I've got two surfaces here. I'm going to select both. I'm going to go down to our commands, and we want to join them together. All right. It's not completely filled in yet, but we'll hold down the Alt key, select the top, hit F, start to type in patch, and we're going to fill in this top section. Right click to accept. Patch will automatically join it to the edges that we selected. Then we're going to hold down Alt, select the bottom edge, F, start to find patch. It's going to fill in the bottom, automatically create it a solid body for us. So as soon as Plasticity knows that this is a closed geometry body, it automatically turned it into a solid for us. Now, if we hadn't used patch on the end, if we'd used loft or something else, it would have created a new surface and we would have had to manually join them together. But either way, we have the ability to turn these complex shapes into solids by either creating a closed watertight volume, by thickening them with the thicken command, or we can use them to do things like cut away from a solid. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this outside face and I'm going to duplicate it. So when I duplicate it, basically what I did was I just copied it, right? So now I have a copy of that original face. Now, if I want to create let's say a cylinder, I'll just grab the cylinder tool and let's go to this view here. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a cylinder, pull it out, move it in the X direction so that it's sticking all the way through here. And then we're going to use the cut command. So with cut, we need our target body, which is our cylinder, and our cutter, which is the surface. And what this does is if we hide the surface and let's say move this out in X, what we did was we cut that solid body with the complex surface. So once again, we can use things like curves and surfaces to cut away from solid bodies. We can actually use solid bodies to cut surfaces as well. And we can create a solid volume by stitching or joining a bunch of surfaces together to make that closed watertight volume. Or we can use tools like thicken to turn them into a solid by giving them a thickness. So this third workflow, this surface or sheets workflow, is a bit different and more involved than, say, the standard additive or subtractive workflows that we have. But what you'll find is that with most designs, you'll be able to use a combination of additive and subtractive. And then in more complex shapes, you maybe need to add in some surface or sheet work, or that might be the entirety of your design. You might do something completely with surfaces or sheets. We have a modeling series on creating a concept car where we used all surfaces and sheets to do that. So as you get started in Plasticity, there is a lot to take in. There's a lot in learning a new program, especially one that is fundamentally different than probably any other program that you've used before. So if you're coming from something like a CAD package, whether it's SolidWorks, Inventor, Fusion, even something like Moai or Shaper 3D, or even SketchUp, there is a logic shift to where you have to work in this direct modeling mindset. Again, an additive workflow where you're just building on your design, a subtractive workflow where you're taking away from it, or using additional tools like surfaces or sheets to create complex bodies or to be used as cut tools or different tools where you can add or remove geometry. You also need to pay close attention to shortcuts. Now, it's not 100% required, but if you're not comfortable with a shortcut workflow, at the very least, getting comfortable with the F key, then it's just going to be a program that is really hard to adopt and get comfortable with. Now, in many cases, you can use most programs without any shortcuts at all, but Plasticity is one of those that really does benefit from getting comfortable and understanding how the shortcuts work and making the most of at least the ones that you use on a common basis. Now, if you have any questions on this please let me know. If you are purchasing Plasticity, remember that we are an affiliate. You can use the code LEAD10 at checkout, save 10% on Plasticity. It does also help out the channel. And if you're looking for more content, we've got plenty of videos on Plasticity in version 24 and 25 and even older. The general workflow has remained the same. The access to the tools and the UI has changed slightly. So if you're getting into some of those older tutorials and having trouble, definitely check out the What's New for 25 version. That will tell you what's changed in the UI and the workflow. And other than that, the workflow itself should be the same. You just have a couple of new tools that you have access to. But again, any questions or comments, please leave them on this video. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.